He modeled himself on David Copperfield. Like David, he ran away from home. Like David, he wanted to be a writer. And after half a century of writing that has enchanted generations of readers, this 72-year-old wordsmith has just been told by a 10-year-old reader that he is not a bad writer. To talk about this and other things, we are at Ivy Cottage, Missouri, celebrated hillside home of celebrated author and poet Ruskin Bond. Mr. Bond, sir, thank you for this privilege.
Thank you, and it's nice to talk to you. And thank you for calling me a poet too, because I thought perhaps not many people knew I wrote poetry.
One has enjoyed your poetry and nature notes as well. I quote from one of your pieces. The hill men go to the plains to make a living. I had to come to the hills to try and make mine. Most of your writings have the foothills of the Himalayas as backdrop. Why this affinity, this love for the hills? You were born in the hills of Kasauli. You had your schooling in the hills. Your parents met in Missouri.
I was born in the hills in Kasauli, but I'm not sure if that's the reason for my affinity for the mountains and my love of them. I think that's something that's sort of grown upon me over the years. I grew up partly in Jamnagar on the west coast, and then in Delhi as a boy, Dehradun, which of course is in the foothills. But I have to say I really discovered the mountains in the early 60s when I was living in Delhi and I wanted to freelance and make my living entirely as a writer, and I decided the best place to do it would be up in the hills. And so I threw up a job that I then had, and I came to Missouri because it was the place I knew best. And 40 years have passed, and I've done what I set out to do, which was write lots of stories and poems and books, and here I am still doing it. But certainly the mountains have played a very important part in my writing as well as in my personal life. Yes, my parents met in Missouri because my mother belonged to Dehradun. Her parents were settled in Dehradun, down in the valley. My father was probably visiting here. Then I went to school in Simla and did most of it there. So I guess I've been familiar with the hills and hill stations ever since I was a boy.
You said something about 40 years in the hills. Here there is a foreword to one of your books, written in 1986, exactly 20 years ago. I would like you to read just this one para.
It was 1986, and times were bad. Bad for Ruskin Bond, writer, who had been pounding his typewriter for over 30 years without achieving fame, money, or even critical approval.
Thank you so much. That was 1986. 20 years hence, are things looking up for Indian writers in general and Ruskin Bond in particular?
Yes, I think things have been looking up both for Indian writers and this particular Indian writer, Ruskin Bond, as well. I think there are various reasons for that. In my case, I think it's because over a period of time, 2 generations or more have grown up on my stories, and sometimes parents are as familiar with them as children. So perhaps time has been on my side and has been friendly. Also, publishing in India has come of age. I would say starting with in the mid to late 80s, when more and more publishers such as Penguin, Rupa, HarperCollins, so many, went into general publishing, apart from just textbook publishing, which was common before that, with the result that more writers are getting published. Books are selling better than before, not in huge numbers as they do in the West, but nevertheless in encouraging quantities. So it's made it possible, I think, for more young writers to get published. As a result, you get new books, new writers coming to the fore, every month, and I think that can only improve and increase.
Publishing in India has come of age, you said. But what about the hype and the hard sell? The huge advances and the fashionable book launches? Are they turning books into commodities? Into just another consumer product?
To some extent, yes. The hype that goes on around a book is something that started off in the West, and where a tremendous amount of publicity goes into selling a book, and you get the creation of prizes like the Booker Prize, where if the author wins it, or even if you're shortlisted for it, it results in a fairly large sale. Although I have to say that if I cannot now recall the names of any of the shortlisted authors during the last 5 or 10 years, only those who actually won it. But so this is something that is now also publishers in India feel they have to do, is to promote books, very often through the authors or through some sort of catchy marketing technique. And if there's a little controversy to go along with it, that helps. So it doesn't always reflect on the quality of the work, I have to say. But it's a part of the modern selling techniques, and I think publishers have to sort of go along with it.
Talking of prizes, the Booker Prize, you won a prize when you were 17, your first big international prize. Could you tell us something about it, and do prizes mean anything to you now?
Prizes, I guess, no, they don't really mean much to me now, but that first one, it was called the Llewellyn Rhys Prize, and in those days it was only worth £50, and that was 1957, and in fact the following year Mr. Naipaul won it for his first book of short stories, Miguel Street. So it was £50 then. I believe the same prize is now £5,000, but there are far bigger prizes. So it wasn't money then that was the criteria. It certainly helped you to be taken more seriously as a writer. It was encouraging for a young writer, particularly as I was just 18 or so at the time. So it did give me a fillip and a sort of kickstart, you might say. So I guess they do help, but I think only in the short run. And over a longer period, it's your consistency in your work and in your writing that will get you to your destination.
So what are you reading at the moment, and who are your favorite authors?
At the moment, I'm reading old short stories for the simple reason that I'm trying to put together another anthology of tales, and in this case, they're tales of terror and suspense. Now, the nice thing about doing anthologies is that I can rediscover and reintroduce sometimes forgotten or neglected writers who were good, but who've been over the years neglected. So that gives me some pleasure, and it means I'm also having to dig around and discover work that is not easily available anymore. But I do, of course, dip into new work sometimes, and I don't want to be completely ignorant, so I try to at least familiarize myself with what is being published today.
I asked you about your old favorite authors.
Oh, old favorites. Oh, well, that would be a very long list. Going back to school days when I grew up on Dickens, modeled myself on David Copperfield, who grew up to be a writer, who ran away from home. So I decided I would run away from home too. But I didn't stay away too long because I didn't take enough pocket money with me. Then other favorites were there, of course, writers like Buchan and Conrad, of course, and Stevenson, and then the short story writers, over the years, beginning with classics like Chekhov and Maupassant, and then through Maugham and H.E. Bates, and I've perhaps always had a preference for the short story, both as a reader and a writer.
So you didn't mention Kipling. You've quoted him more than once, and he too liked the Himalayas.
Yes, of course I ought to mention Kipling. I wasn't fond of Kipling as a boy. Perhaps because we had to study Kim in school. If you had to study a book, you get rather put off. But I think I was in my 20s when I read perhaps Kim on my own volition and enjoyed it, and then read a lot of Kipling and felt that although he of course had an outdated sort of imperialistic way of looking at India, and nevertheless he brought the countryside to life and people. He was capture the Indian atmosphere very vividly. And of course, he told a very good story too, especially in Plain Tales from the Hills and the Jungle Books.
And his love for the Himalayas? You have quoted him that bit about returning to the hills to die.
Yes, somewhere he says that once you've lived in the mountains, you have to come back again and again, and that's true. I came back again and again. Kipling didn't actually.
How did you first know that you wanted to write, and who introduced you to the magical world of stories and writing?
Well, I guess I suppose as a small boy, my father did encourage me in that he brought me books. I think the first book I read was to be an Alice in Wonderland, and then I used to keep a little diary too. But in the early days, it was really lists of books I'd read or films I'd seen or songs I'd liked. So it only became a proper journal as I grew a little older. At school too, I had one or two excellent English teachers, and they encouraged me to write, to read. I was good at essays, won sort of prizes at that. And I remember boys used to come to me and ask me to write their love letters, you see, because it was a very important thing then, those days, writing love letters. And and I was good at writing love letters. So I was in demand, you might say, as a letter writer. And then when I finished school, my first story got published, and actually it got me into trouble because it was a skit about one of my teachers, and they didn't appreciate it back at school. And I think my school leaving certificate got held up for quite some time. In fact, I think I'm still waiting for it.
That's an interesting anecdote. You, sir, are still waiting for your school leaving certificate. So much for certificates. Let's move on to challenges. Satyajit Ray had once said that after retirement, he would concentrate on children's literature, which was the most difficult and hence most challenging genre. You, sir, started with adolescent literature and moved on to writing for adults and then to children's books. Which do you find most challenging?
Yes, Satyajit Ray was certainly right when he said children's writing for children was a great challenge and very difficult. And he wrote some beautiful stories for children. I did come to it rather late and perhaps a bit by accident, because my early stories and books were written for the general reader. I didn't have a particular age in mind. And then one of my stories, which wasn't, it was called Angry River. It was perhaps too short to be a novel and too long to be a short story. And one of my publishers suggested that if I rewrote it as a children's story, it would be quite appealing. And I did that, and it was quite successful. And so I went on and did others. And then, of course, I found that writing for children had its own rewards. And children themselves make excellent critics, and they're very honest and frank ones. They don't flatter you necessarily. And I think the best compliment I've had was quite recently from a girl who must have been 10 or 12, and somebody asked her, "What do you think of Ruskin Bond as a writer?" And she looked at me and she said, "Sir, you're not a bad writer." So I took that as a great compliment.
So writing for children has its own rewards, you said. How about writing for cinema? In May this year, you know, sir, we entered the 150th year of the First War of Independence. Your haunting story, A Flight of Pigeons, was set against the backdrop of that uprising and made into an unforgettable film by Shyam Benegal, Junoon. How did that story happen, A Flight of Pigeons?
Well, A Flight of Pigeons is set in Shah Jahanpur, where the actual incident took place. This was, in fact, my father's birthplace too, and some of the incidents in the story I'd heard from him. And then later I'd read accounts of what had happened maybe to individuals who were caught up in the conflict of that time. In particular, this young girl who lost her father, and it appealed to me, and it appealed to me because it showed how individuals from different communities actually helped or were willing to help each other in times of conflict and crisis, even when their own interests might have been affected. So, although her father is killed in the uprising, she and her mother find shelter first in a Hindu household and then with a Pathan family until the actual war is over. So I was just trying to show how common humanity in people often shines through in times of conflict, hatred, war.
I think you did a wonderful job, sir. When do we see yet another movie adapted from your writings?
There just has been one. Vishal Bhardwaj, who's made a few films, including a children's film called Makri and others. He filmed my story, The Blue Umbrella, last winter, and the film was shown at the recent Goa Film Festival. It hasn't had a general release yet, which is why not many people know about it. But I did see it, and it's a very lyrical, charming film, beautifully photographed, set up here in the hills. I hope people will get a chance to view it before long.
Is that your typewriter I see there?
Yes, I've got 3 old typewriters. I don't use them now. I haven't gone on to computers. I've gone back to writing by hand. And as I still have a good handwriting, my publishers are quite happy to accept my handwritten manuscripts. So I'm saved now from typing as well as anything of a technical nature.
I think Agatha Christie also liked writing longhand. And till the end, she wrote longhand, except for a brief spell when she tried the dictaphone and she was very unhappy with it. Looking at your typewriter, I remember one of your quotes. You said something about your typewriter being a repository of a writer's loneliness. And you've repeatedly brought in the theme, loneliness as a leitmotif. And your autobiography, Naipaul, after reading it, he said something about that he hasn't read another book about solitude from India. Any comments on loneliness, on solitude?
Well, I do appreciate his comments, and although perhaps the theme of solitude or loneliness might come through in my writing in perhaps even in a stronger vein in some of my stories and or essays such as Rain in the Mountains, another collection. Scenes from a Writer's Life was a fairly straightforward account of my early years. But of course, they were lonely years. It was a lonely childhood, and perhaps that does come through. And I am a person of solitude, even if I'm living with a number of people. And I guess most writers are, or certainly the more subjective writers, those who write from within themselves, out of their own lives, as compared to the more objective writer who's perhaps looking outwards.
We asked you about your favorite authors. Who are your favorite singers?
My favorite singer? Well, people don't allow me to sing, you see, otherwise I'd be my favorite singer. But if I sing in a car, it breaks down instantly. If I sing at a party, people go home. I'm the world's worst singer. So, but I used to like tenors and baritones like Nelson Eddy or Richard Tauber and other singers from the 30s and 40s, but very unfashionable now. You won't hear them easily.
We'd like to hear them. Sir, would you mind humming a few lines from a Nelson Eddy song for us?
I dare not. I dare not. You lose all your listeners. Huh? All right. Oh, Rosemary, I love you. I'm always dreaming of you. We'll leave it to that.
Sir, how about one more?
Another Nelson Eddy song called Great Day. When you are down and out, lift up your head and shout, it's going to be a great day.
You've just made my day. That was wonderful.
Yes, please, you find some old Nelson Eddy records in your old All India radio collection and play one or two. That would be, I'll certainly listen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bond, for singing for us and for sharing your thoughts and your time with us.
Thank you so much.